And thank you very much for everyone for coming tonight. And Robert, let's go ahead and learn about how to make our websites faster.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. So let me know when you can see that, okay? Did it all look good?
Looks good.
Yep.
All right, let's get started then. We're going to talk about making the web faster. So a little bit about myself here. I've got my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. I am going to provide the slides and the code. So I have a fictional travel webpage that's a before and after. So I have the code for both of those two, and the slides will be available on a link at the end. But if you do want to, if you think of questions later, feel free to reach out on any of those channels, and I'll show that again at the end. So let's talk about first performance rules. So I used to work on compilers years ago. So when I'm a C# ASP.NET developer, when I started looking at performance for our website, I was really thinking about my C# code. I think that's kind of natural. You know, where could I make tweaks? Am I using the right algorithms? Could I make that faster than it is? And it turns out about when I was interested, Steve Souders wrote a really good book on web performance, and he had 14 rules in there. But the important thing I took from that right away was for most websites he researched, 80 or 90% of the time that someone waits is actually for your page resources, your images, your JavaScript, your now web fonts, all of those things that go into the page. Most websites, that's where people spend time. So I'm going to show you how you can measure, but most often you're not actually talking about optimizing server-side code. We're actually going to focus on all of these other things. The main three rules will focus on make fewer HTTP requests. So obviously we don't want to request things we don't use. I put it in italics because years ago in the HTTP 1.1 world, it was very important. You only had 6 connections per host. So there were a lot of techniques that I used to present and talk about to intentionally reduce the number of requests we had because you only had 6 connections that were available. Nowadays with HTTP 2, that's gone away. So I'll talk about that towards the end, but obviously don't make requests you don't need, but intentionally using some of the techniques to reduce solely requests by bundling and things like that, you probably don't want to do anymore if you're using HTTP 2. You want to send as little as possible, and you want to send it as infrequently as possible. So those are the techniques we're going to focus on in this talk. And by the way, this applies to any framework you use. I mean, any website you're developing, these things are going to make sense for you. It's not just my ASP.NET world. Anybody doing any of these, this will make sense. I'm going to show you Fiddler. So Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. So this is a tool I use daily to, I'm a full-time web developer on an e-commerce site. So I'm constantly in Fiddler for various reasons. And I'm going to show it to you tonight because there's lots of ways that we can use it for performance. So it was written by Eric Lawrence. He was working at Microsoft. He didn't know C#, he didn't know .NET, he didn't know HTTP. He actually got books. He needed it for work for some of his coworkers and wrote Fiddler, which I think is pretty cool. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012. And I gave you a link to the free versions. There's actually 2 of them now. I'm going to use Fiddler Classic tonight. Fiddler Everywhere has launched recently. So if you haven't seen that, Fiddler Everywhere is a cross-platform version. So it runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It doesn't have all of the features yet. They're working on that. But if you needed a Fiddler to run on a Mac or Linux especially, or you just want to take advantage of an updated UI, you can look into Fiddler Everywhere. So again, I'm going to use Fiddler Classic today. So here again is where you can get it. I'm just going to start it up. And again, if you haven't used it before, so Fiddler is going to sit between my browser and my web server. So let's go look at our fictional travel page here. So I'm not a designer, so I just use Bootstrap. And I've got a carousel up top here. And then I just have a number of images from various places. So I actually went to Sydney, and you can walk up the bridge, which is really cool in Sydney Harbor. I found out my dad was afraid of heights that day, which would have been good to know, I think, before that. But so pretty typical looking web page. If I go over and look at Fiddler, I can start looking at some of the performance features. One of them that I want to start with is statistics. So if I look, I've got about 12 requests and it's just about 3 meg. So not that atypical. Usually most web pages today, if you go to HTTP archive, most web pages today average about 75 to 100 requests, and they're anywhere from 2 to 3 meg. So it's pretty typical for size. Usually other websites do a lot more requests than that, but just to give you a feeling for, that's how we started before we made these performance improvements. We'll go run the after version of the same thing, and you'll see visually it all looks the same. But if I go take a look at what it looks like on the wire here with Fiddler, if I look at statistics, I've got only 330K. I must have something extra in here. Usually I have a little less than that. But the idea here is if you look, I've got, oh, for some reason I'm pulling Bootstrap in. All right. I've got this down to about 300K, which is less than some of the images that I had up here above. So just a feeling for, this is kind of the teaser for the before and after. We're going to look at a lot of different techniques. I didn't use every technique in my after that I'm going to show you, but I used a lot of them. So just a quick view to see how much of a difference you can make by applying some of these techniques. And again, we'll come back to Fiddler later. When you're doing performance work, it's important to think about metrics. How do you want to measure, and what are you going to use to see that you're making improvements? What are important measures for your customers? So the first one I'll talk about is this first byte, and I just put IT after it. So that is a good thing to look at to make sure that it's not your server-side code, right? When you hit the web page, this is going to be the time it takes from the browser to get to the server for it to run the, in my case, ASP.NET, give back the first byte of the response. If this metric is really high, you do actually have a server-side problem, right? And then you have to find out where server-side is my issue. I've switched to use speed index recently. So speed index is, it was created years ago by webpagetest.org, and I'll show you their site here in a little bit. But the idea of this is they wanted a better customer metric. So the idea with speed index is the viewport. So on my desktop, the viewport above the fold, they wanted to know about when most of that was visually complete. So they came up with speed index, which is really just the number of milliseconds before my viewport is basically filled with content. So I like to use that. Previously, there were other measures we'll talk about, like when web performance was first new, there weren't that many timers built into browsers. So we tended to focus on things like on load or when the page is fully loaded. Those aren't that interesting. I want to know from a user's perspective how fast things are painting for them. There's also time to interactive. So that's not only is it visually so they think the page is ready, but it's active. Like I can click on things and it will respond. So that's time to interactive. Recently, Google has come out with what they call Web Vitals down below here, which is really 3 different measures. Largest contentful paint is similar to speed index. When is the most largest thing on your viewport visible? First input delay, again, is when you can first start to interact with it. And cumulative layout shift is interesting. I'm sure we've all been to websites where it starts to render and then things are moving all over the place. It's just not a great experience. So they decided to combine all 3 of these together and call them Web Vitals. And I'm starting to see tool support for this. So it's something that you could look at. Again, the important thing is you just have to choose a measure that makes sense for you or multiple measures. And just make sure that as you're making improvements that you can see it makes a difference to these kinds of measurements. How do you measure? We'll talk about webpagetest.org. It's free. It's a nice tool that lets you, they basically have computers all over the world where I can go connect to them. I can set bandwidth speeds and browser types. I can even they have live mobile devices, and I can hit my website and get some nice measurements. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. We talked about Fiddler. You'll see that throughout the talk here. And there's really 2 other types of measurements that are important. The first one is called synthetic monitoring. So we've been using synthetic monitoring on our website for probably 15 years. And what that is we have hired a company that has agents all across, in our case, all across the United States. They hit various pages on my site every 15 minutes or however often I specify. And then I can watch my performance over time. So it's nice because every time I make a change, I know I'm running the same computers in the same places. So it's a nice measurement for me to see apples to apples 1 week from another. The clients are exactly the same and how's stuff run. So that's interesting, but I also want to use the other component, which is real user monitoring. So this came out not that many years ago. Browsers started doing these standards below where they measured everything. So they connect to my page, they look up DNS, connection, time to first byte, but they also measure every resource I use. So every image, every CSS, they collect all of this on the client and send it back to a server. So not only do I have the synthetic or fake lab data, but now I have what are my customers actually experiencing. So I can see the people who have bad connections. I can see people with old phones. How do they behave? So a combination of those two things is useful. So let's take a look at web page tests. So I hosted these sites out in Azure so that I could hit it. Web page test does have a private agent if you're interested in that as well. But I can come out here, punch in my URL. I can choose a test location. Like I said, they have them all around the world. I can choose my browser. I will typically come in and say I want to capture video, and I would start a test. So I didn't want to make you wait, so I pre-ran these tests. So this is the before version. So I kept it the same. I just used Lincoln, Nebraska and Chrome on a cable modem, and I ran the test for before and after. So the first thing we'll see, they do some rough scoring here and give me some grades. And then here are all the various measurements we talked about. So you can see the one important one is the speed index. So what that's telling me is it took about 5.4 seconds before the page felt like it was visible for a customer. Here are the web vitals we talked about. And then you can also see the fully loaded when it had all of the files, and it gives you a rough idea of cost. So it's telling me that even though this is a pretty simple page, it's pretty expensive. I mean, there's a lot of weight here for people to have to download. I like to use the waterfall diagrams. So if you've seen waterfall diagrams before, you're going to get my HTML page, and it breaks it down into DNS time, connection, time to create. In this case, I didn't use HTTPS, but I can see it connected and got my HTML. Then it started getting JavaScript files. Then it started getting my CSS. And you can see I've got images here that are relatively large, and they're taking quite a while to download. So from about 1.75 seconds, some of the images then were still finishing out here at about 7 seconds. So we can get a quick view of this and just get an idea of where we should focus some of our time. The other thing I really like about web page tests, I need to deal with marketing people, and I need to tell them, I don't put that huge image on the home page, and I can tell them how many seconds it will add. It usually doesn't mean much until you start showing them videos. So I can show a video. This is, this live Chrome browser hitting, and you can see it's just partially painting. And then at about 5.8 seconds, now the page looks like it's visible, okay? If I go do the same thing with the after version, you can see I score a lot better. The only issue I had it on a virtual machine that looks like I need to do a little work about how I had my ciphers set up or something. But you can see my speed index is down from 5 point some seconds to a second. So think about that, right? I mean, that's the big win, the techniques we're talking about. We went from nearly 6 seconds down to just about an even second here. Again, I can look at the waterfall. I can see that across the board it's better because the whole thing's finishing in a second. And I can still see, this is some of the HTTP2 trickery. If you saw before, it had kind of a step ladder of requests because there were only 6 connections. Here I used HTTP2, so you can see I'm downloading all of the stuff in parallel, which is a big advantage of HTTP2. So again, if I go back to the video here, so within a second. So I like to keep this. So web page test keeps these results basically forever. So whenever I'm doing performance improvements, I like to come out and run a test, save it, do whatever the improvement is, run it again afterwards. And this is just part of my documentation for my project, because inevitably 2 years from now, somebody will say, why did you use compression, or why did you do whatever? I can show them a visual objective measurements of this is before, this is after. That's why we did that. So if they question why we're doing it, I've got some good evidence to back up why we're doing that. So that's a good way to do some of the measurements.
So Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think web page test also supports mobile devices, right? Where you can
Yes,
simulate mobile devices, and you know, unfortunately, not everybody's on like a really fast, you know, 5G network or cable modem or whatever, right? They're you can be on a
absolutely.
crappy 3G network, which you talk
Yep.
about kind of driving home a point, you know, for your marketing people. Is okay. Well, let's put this on a mobile device on maybe not a great network, and then see how long it takes, right?
Yep. And so here I can choose, depending on what you pick for a test location. You can see I'm picking an iPhone 8 in this case with iOS 13. And so yeah, it's really nice. And like I said, you can, if you need to get to internal stuff, they do have free private instances. So you can do that if you're interested in that as well. But very nice tool. Okay, so that's some of the measurement stuff. Next thing to consider is, are you good enough, right? When do you quit? Does performance really matter? So it was interesting, both Amazon and Walmart intentionally slowed their website by 100 milliseconds, so a tenth of a second. And they did an A/B test to measure what did that do to their sales. And coincidentally, for both of them, they both lost 1% of their sales by being only a tenth of a second slower. So if you think about the reverse, right? I know 100 milliseconds slower, I lose 1%. I'd like to know the reverse too, right? As I speed things up, how much more am I selling? I'd love to do this with my own website. I'm having a hard time convincing people to allow me to do the slow part. But if I could do it, I could tie directly from my customers and my website exactly a correlation between performance and sales. And why I want that is every time a designer comes and says, let's use a brand new font on the site, you know, it's part of our branding and we're going to sell more, whatever they want it for, I can measure and say, okay, that's going to add 150 milliseconds. So I guarantee you that's going to lose X% of our sales. Is that worth it? Is whatever you're doing, it becomes just mathematical, right? It's just budgeting. It's things that business people understand, rather than just tell them, no, you can't have that font. It's not my decision anymore. Here's what you're going to lose in sales. If you're going to gain something from it, great. If not, don't do it, right? It's nice to compare yourself with competitors. So I'll show you. Speed Curve is a vendor of RUM solutions. I'm going to open up my browser here again. And we'll go back and pull up they actually have major e-commerce sites. And you can come out here and play with this for yourself, but I'm in the retail. And so I'm going to just look retail on a slow device using speed metric. What do my competitors look like, right? Where's Amazon? Where's Walmart? So when I get my own measurements, I can come here and see, how do we stack up, right? Are we better than Amazon? Are we worse? It's just nice to be able to say a gauge for business people of where you sit compared to other people. And then you can play with the fast and see the difference. So again, it just helps you understand, have I done enough? Do I keep investing in performance, right? The other one that's useful, Google has their telemetry built into Chrome. So they're basically doing RUM for you for free. So as long as your website is large enough, you can come out to this URL. I'll show you what it looks like. I'm not actually going to run it at the moment because it takes a little bit. But I can come out here and punch in my website, and it will actually go then and check all of its telemetry. So everybody who's using Chrome, in this case on mobile devices, it's basically reporting back, and then Google will tell me your site on average on mobile devices in the US is X number of seconds. So again, I use this internally as a gauge as I make performance improvements, or if we add stuff to the site and it gets slow, this is one of our measurements that we like to just see real customers, in this case, Chrome on a phone. How are they behaving, and what is our site experience like? So I've got through some of the measurements and stuff. Like I said, it's good to have these in place. Now I'm going to start focusing on techniques. I tried to rank the techniques for ease of implementation and big wins first, and it'll kind of go as we go. But the first one's compression. So if you're familiar with compression, we turned this on probably 15 years ago. So we were hosting our website in rural Minnesota, and we started hitting bandwidth limits. We just couldn't get enough bandwidth in for our website. So we looked and we found compression, and we turned that on, and basically the next day we used 53% less bandwidth. And our synthetic measurements of these agents were 25% faster. So all we had to do was go in IIS and say, I want to do compression. So what browsers do is they send an accept encoding header to say that they support compression. Today, all the modern browsers support it. There's various versions. I put Brotli as one of the newest ones, not natively supported yet in IIS, so I just put it in italics. But we turn on compression not only for all of our static files, but for our dynamic files. So easy win, free, built into most web servers. The only argument years ago was this does have a slight CPU impact. So obviously, what I tell you, this is pretty much a guaranteed win. If you're not sure, obviously test stuff out for yourself, right? Put this in your environment, give it a shot, test it, make sure it matters for you. But the argument against it at the time was it had a slight impact on CPU, which has even got better in the years. It was in the single percentages. And I guess my argument was if you're that close to being tight on CPU, if you're within 2% where your server's suddenly done for CPU, you have other problems, right? So this is a pretty easy turn on. You're going to save a lot of bandwidth when you enable this and just make it faster for your clients. You're just sending a lot less data. Next one we'll talk about is content expirations. So the idea for me, my ideal goal is that if you come to my website today, you run my ASP.NET page, I give you all the HTML. You're gonna have to download all my images, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, all that stuff. Ideally, if you were to come back tomorrow, I do want you to come back and rerun the ASP.NET page. You know, data might be different, I might have promotions, whatever. But if nothing else has changed, I want to have you pull all of those images and CSS and JavaScript out of your browser cache, right? It's not going to ever be faster than just pulling it right off your own machine. You won't use my bandwidth. You won't use your data plan. It's just going to be a lot faster. And so the problem is by default, if you've ever done Fiddler traces and such, and you see these 304 not modified responses, if you don't specifically set what you want for a content expiration, you're leaving it up to the browser to do what they call heuristics and decide if they think that they need to come back and ask for the stuff. So you could have come yesterday, got all of my stuff, and the browser would come back tomorrow and say, oh, I need your CSS sheet again. And it'll say, well, I think it might not be fresh anymore. So it may come back, even though you had the whole thing already cached, you might come back to the server just to get a 304 back that says, oh, never mind, you already have the most recent. So you specifically want to set content expiration. So for me, I have all of my CSS and JavaScript. I do bundling and version, which we'll talk about later, but I set those for a year. So if you come and get my CSS and my JavaScript, every time I do a build, I put a version number on those. So if you got them, I want you to keep them as long as I can. And the maximum recommended is a year. That way, hopefully, unless I change my CSS or JavaScript, you don't have to come back and get it again. Problem would be, let's say you came today, you got my logo.svg, and then suddenly I need to change it, right? And I really want you to see the new one. Well, the way to deal with expirations and still force you to come back is I'll just change my name from logo.svg to logo1.svg, right? The browser then will see that it doesn't have that cached. It'll come back to the server, get the new one, and everybody's happy. So I know not everybody's using IIS. I'm just going to show you an example. This is an easy server-side setting. So if I came into, for instance, CSS, it's under the HTTP response headers, set common headers, and you can see I just say expire web content, 365 days. And if you come into Fiddler, the way that you can tell that they're using caching is this column right here. You can see this max age. That's actually in seconds. So these things are cached for a year. I think I have 30 days for my images. So again, it's just great trade-off for me. I'm going to use your browser cache if it's there. And then if I do have to force an update, I can rename the file. As long as the URL is different, it'll come back and pick up the original. So again, a pretty easy win. Shouldn't be hard to do some settings on your server and you're good to go. Another one is content delivery network. So it's funny how things happen. Literally two, I think they were Google employees, I'm not sure, were at a bar and they got in an argument. Is it bandwidth or latency that matters, right? Every time you go to an ISP, you say, I want to get service at my house. What are they bragging about? They're bragging about the bandwidth. You know, you got 100 megabits per second, whatever, right? It turns out if you follow the link to that article, what they decided to do a comparison. And they said, we are going to keep making your bandwidth better, or we're going to make your latency better. We're going to see which one has a bigger impact on most websites. So latency is just the amount of time it takes from your browser to get to the server and back. So that's very dependent on distance, right? Well, if you go read that whole article, it turns out latency matters. So the idea with a CDN, you want to use a CDN because they're going to have a global network of servers that are geographically much closer to your customers than your actual data center. So my data center is still in Minnesota, and I've got customers all over the United States. I want those customers ideally to be able to get my images, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, all of those things I want served from an edge server on a CDN. The good news, again, we did this 15 years ago. Again, we were running out of bandwidth, so it was mostly a bandwidth play at the time. But we saw big increases for performance just because these customers don't have to come all the way back across the US to get stuff. And the nice thing is there's so many of them now, it's come down a lot in price and you have a lot of choices. So let's just look at what that would look like from a coding standpoint. So normally I would reference images like this, right, within my website. When I get a CDN, they'll give me a subdomain name. So here I've got cdn.example.com. If you notice, I referenced all of my resources like from my CDN using what's called a protocol-less URL if you've never seen this before. That lets it use either HTTP or HTTPS, whichever one the page uses. Today you should be using all HTTPS, so I could have just used that, but years ago we supported both, so that's kind of a neat trick. But the idea now is if I have a customer, say in Florida, and they hit my web page, they'll pull up cdnexample.com. The CDN's DNS server will give back the IP address of the closest CDN server. So maybe there's a CDN server in Orlando, for instance. It'll give back that IP address. So the browser will try to get all of these files, in this case, my flag small. They're going to try to pull that from Florida instead of coming all the way back to Minnesota because latency matters. If it turns out that that CDN server didn't already have this, that CDN server would come back to me and get it and then cache it locally based on my expirations again. So again, CDNs are cool. I'll mention a little trick up here. I hosted all of my JavaScript and my CSS files on my CDN. I had one hiccup in the history of using my CDN and it didn't serve my CSS. So I actually had a blank page for part of a day. So I learned how to do fallback. So you can look at this fallback code. I use jQuery. So if jQuery didn't get loaded properly from the CDN, it'll actually rewrite a local script reference. So I get the best of both worlds. If the CDN's working, it's going to be fast. If it turns out it didn't work, it'll actually come back and pull it from my server as a fallback. So, and again, so I put all my images, all my CSS, I host them on my server, but the CDN servers will pull them, and I have all of those things out on my CDN. Next one we'll talk about is bundling and minification. So I put the bundling in italics because in HTTP2 world, I probably don't want to do that, but we will talk about minification. Minification is still an important thing. So I recommend you minify your CSS and JavaScript. You can possibly do your HTML. I have found that it impacts layouts sometimes, so I don't actually do mine, but I want to show you, if you haven't seen it, why you want to use minification. So let's pull up this Bootstrap one here. If you haven't seen a minified file, that's what it looks like. right? All the comments, all the spacing has been removed. So why do you do that? You do that because it's smaller. So a minified version of Bootstrap JavaScript is 59K. If I look at the version that's not minified, we're looking at 134K. So quite a bit larger just by using minification. So even though you're doing compression, you want to do both. You want to use minified files and you want to use compression. So again, it just is reducing the amount of time. So I took all of my JavaScript, all of my CSS, I minified all of them. I did this quite a few years ago. So in the HTTP 1.1 world, I was telling you wanted to reduce the number of connections that you used because you only had 6 for each host. So we actually bundled all of our JavaScript files into a file, bundled all of our CSS files into a CSS file, and our homepage was nearly 50% faster. So again, at build time, if I'm building for release, I do minification, bundling, and I tack version numbers on it so that I get all the expirations and all that stuff. So a good technique. Again, we'll talk about whether you should do the bundling. Again, depends on your version of HTTP. Next, we'll talk about images. So years and years ago, we had designers that wanted to use a certain font, right? And this was pre-web font days. So they would actually create an image that had the text in the font they wanted. So we had to use images for that. We also, if we ever showed a gradient, kind of where the color slowly changes, that also had to be an image. Nowadays, those things, we have web fonts, we have CSS3 for gradients. Now that those techniques are available in CSS3, use those because they're much lighter weight than actually using images, okay? The next thing to know about images, always pick the proper type. So if you're doing a logo, you should be using an SVG, especially if you're using a responsive website. So our site is responsive, which just means it works small, medium, large breakpoints. So phone, tablet, desktop, it adjusts itself, right, using responsive design techniques. If I use an SVG, it's a vector graphic, which just means it will auto scale. It uses math to lay out the image. So no matter how big my screen is, it just adjusts and it looks perfect all the time. So if you're doing a logo and stuff, use an SVG. If you're doing photos, use a JPEG. I will say there are a couple new versions, WebP, AVIF. I haven't used those a lot, and we'll talk about why, but I'm just saying don't use PNG, use a JPEG. So let's look at why. So I do get challenged occasionally where people will say, well, you can use PNGs for photos. I know you can because we did it. So I say, do it then, show it to me. So here's our bridge walk, 1024, right? This is our JPEG. If I do the exact same thing as a PNG, you'll see visually they're about the same as far as quality. But if you look at the size difference, the JPEG is 58K and the PNG is 516K. And we'll talk about why that is. It's because I did some compression on it in a moment, but that's why I use JPEGs instead of PNGs for photos. So just start by knowing what type of image is it. You know, first of all, do I have to have an image? And then second of all, make sure you use the right type. And if you're not sure and you don't believe this, try your other one and see the quality and the size. But that's how those shake out generally. I talked about responsive design. So when responsive design first came out, the problem was we had a single image tag, right? Just IMG source. And we had to make that image look good on a desktop and a phone. So people would point to the image that was a very high quality, large image because they needed that for the desktop on high pixel density displays. However, that meant you're downloading a huge image to a phone, which probably had, back then especially, had a poor connection. So we didn't want to do that, right? We're sending a lot more data than we need to. Well, thankfully now, the browser, actually the community came together and came up with source set and picture and took it back, and the browser vendors agreed and implemented that. So let's go back and look what that looks like. So what you do is you take, I'll actually show you on disk here too. I took that same bridge walk and I create various sizes. And there's all sorts of research out there on what sizes are right. It's going to depend on your design breakpoints. You can look into that. I just start simple with, I want 128, 256, 512, 1024, and 2048. And the reason you want to do this, if look, my largest image is 187K. If I don't need that for a really small space on the screen, especially on a phone, if 128 width works fine, that's only 2K. That's, you know, that's 100 times almost larger between those two. So what do you do? And I just choose, these are the widths. I choose to put my widths into my file name. So when I look at my web server logs, I can see the most popular downloaded ones. So ignore the wizard behind the curtain with this for a moment. But all I need to do then is say I have an image. I'm going to use source set in this case. And I give it a list of here are all of the image sizes available. And I'm handing it to the browser. I'm saying, you know the connection. You know if it's high pixel density. You know how this has to fit on the screen and how large it has to be. So you pick the best one. I'm kind of a control freak. So when I first did this, it kind of worried me that, you know, will it pick the right one? We've been doing this for years and it's worked great. And then I've done testing with Fiddler and stuff, and you can tell based on your design breakpoint and what it needs, it gets the appropriate one for that size. So that's cool that that's now built into browsers. I'll mention there's also client hints. That's relatively new, where instead of doing the source set and saying, here's all the sizes, the client will tell the server, I have this pixel density, here's the size I want. It'll give it a bunch of hints about the client, so the server can choose the appropriate sized image and just give just that image back. So that's another option going forward. But again, just that's the basic about images that I want you to be aware of. And images are usually about 60% of most web page weight. So it's an easy place to make good choices and have a big impact on your speed. When you saw the waterfall at the beginning, a lot of my time on the poor site was because I had images that I had not optimized. So again, why do I do JPEG? Because you can do compression. You can trade off size and quality. And I'll warn you, if you ever say that in front of a designer, which I have, it really freaks them out. So I did that. I told a designer, I said, we're going to use a JPEG. We're going to compress these images and trade off quality and size. And they said, oh, it has to look perfect. You can't do that. And I said, I'll make, and we got in pretty good arguments about it. So I said, tell you what, I'm going to make a web page for you. And I'm going to put various sized or compressed images on it. And if you can pick the real one from the list, I will use the real one. And if you can't, then you let me use the one that's correct, right? So I gave him a couple freebies, right? That looks horrible. That looks horrible. Just to acknowledge that you can do it wrong. But if you look at the rest of these 5, which one do you think is the original? Especially even stacked against each other. It turns out this is the original, was about 172K. This one down below it is 32K. So it's, you know, more than a fifth, it's only a fifth of the size. And visually, you really can't tell a difference. Now, if you're running a photo site, right, like this is your business, absolutely matters to you. But you can play with that compression level and you can get to the point where you're still satisfied the quality is absolutely the same. Or here, you know, this is good enough for me. This is the same representation to me, but it's a lot smaller. So that's where I got a lot of wins in the after site. I just optimized a lot of the images. So I use PaintShop Pro. And so there's actually just a slider in there. I can literally say I want to optimize it. It'll pull up the original and the one I'm on. I can just play with the compression and it'll visually change. And I can just get to that point where I think it still looks the same, but it's a lot smaller. And then I save it. We also use Photoshop for our professional graphics people. You can actually write a batch script. So we take all of our product photos, run them through a batch script that automatically does what we consider a safe compression, where it'll still look good, but it'll be a lot smaller, so you don't have to do it all manually. So that's kind of cool. Another thing is progressive. So if you've been doing web forever, like I have, you'll and you're around in the modem days like I was, you might remember progressive. I'm going to show you if you've never seen this before. So I'm sorry, I just went into Fiddler and I told it to run like it was a modem, okay? Because I want to show you the difference between progressive. So if I pull up these images, watch what happens. On the left side is the progressive image. On the right side is what most everybody does for JPEG, which is called a baseline JPEG. Watch them paint again. If your client is on a slow connection, progressives download the basic shape of the image, and then the quality slowly gets better. But if you're sitting just watching as a customer on a screen, you feel like that left side right there is done. As opposed to if you have a slow connection, the thing on the right is just painful, right? Again, it's not hard to save this way. Yeah, PaintShop Pro has a feature. You just have to go in and say save as JPEG, but choose progressive as the format instead of baseline. They turn out to be the same size, like there's no size penalty for download. You just get a different painting experience. So now that modem is mobile is much more popular for websites today, we're actually on our website doing a test of should we switch all of our JPEGs back to progressive, because we think that it might give a perceived speed advantage by the customer thinking the page is basically painted just because of how they paint. So let me take this off so it's not slow for the rest of the talk. The other thing I'll mention is metadata. So when you take pictures that you host on the web, I'm going to use another tool here in Fiddler. There's an extension you can download called image bloat. So I'm going to say show image bloat. I'm going to go pull up these images and hit Control F5. So when you take a picture with your camera, depending on how you have it configured on your smartphone, it's going to have your lat long. So it's going to have your geolocation, sidebar, drug czar in South America, finally let somebody come in and interview him in the jungle. So they got, jungle behind them, so they couldn't figure out where they were. They let the reporter come take a picture of him sitting there in the jungle. Reporter had geo stuff enabled it. And so when they posted the image for the report, people could go in and say, here's the lat long, and they basically found him. So I'm sure you're not a drug czar, but you still don't want metadata, right? Because the other thing in here has got shutter speed, what camera you used, all that stuff doesn't visually help your image. It just makes your file bigger. So by running this extension in Fiddler, it's showing me that 15% of this image is metadata. So I use a tool called JPEGtran. It's just a command line utility that will strip out metadata. And so all that stuff gets removed. It has no visual impact, but it just makes it a smaller download. And I like using image bloat because when I'm done, I can just walk through my site and I'll see visually all of the images that still have metadata. So that's kind of a cool way to do that. Another thing we do for images is we do lazy loading. So we've done this for years. So we're a food site. And if you came to my ice cream category, I might have 50 different types of ice cream, right? Years ago, we looked like search engines did, where you'd see the first 10, you'd hit to go see the next page. One day my designer came and said, I'd really like that to all be in one page. And I said, well, that's a cool design, but I might be downloading 40 some images that most people, if they don't scroll down, they're never going to see. So I'm making it slower for everybody, even if they don't scroll down and see stuff. So lazy loading lets you say, I'm going to identify images that are below the fold. So the newspaper analogy, right? Stuff that's not in the normal viewport that they're going to have to scroll for. I'm going to put this lazy loading. So it's got native support. So Chrome and I think Firefox just came out with native support for this not that long ago. But if you go out to Can I Use, if you've never been out to Can I Use before, Can I Use is just a website where you can punch in HTML and CSS features and see how well they're supported by browsers. So the lazy loading attribute is decent support. But then if I used it IE11, iOS Safari, which happens to be a really large portion of my customer base, wouldn't take advantage of this. So I don't use this yet. I still use this plugin that we've used for years. And all that plugin does, that's what this magic was. If I had source set or image source or whatever, I just put a data dash in front of it and tell it to lazy load. And then I include that plugin here at the bottom. So now what happens is I know that these images that are down here on my travel page, pull up the before or the after, it doesn't really matter, these down here. I know those aren't going to be shown unless you scroll. So by doing this, as the browser is scrolling, that plugin looks and says, oh, this image, so I'll go right here, this image on the bottom left is about to come in visible. So it takes the data dash off, which forces the browser to go ask for the image. So if it is all working well, it'll be seamless. The person won't even notice that they're being lazy loaded. And it's a good trade-off because I want the first paint up here to be super fast. I'll make it a little more of an impact if you happen to scroll rather than penalize everybody who comes to the page. So that's a good technique to use. This is one I had to write myself. We have a lot of third-party beacons and stuff on our website that was impacting my page rendering. I wanted them to all happen after page load occurs. So I actually wrote this. You can use it if it makes sense for you. I've got this little JavaScript I wrote that's up at the top here. So I made up these attributes. So data dash attributes are just things that browsers ignore, but you can use in your code. So I've got data dash deferred source or data dash deferred source set. If I specify those, so if we come down here, for instance, I could say I have this third-party JavaScript. It doesn't impact my rendering. Maybe it's analytics. Maybe it's something that has to happen, but I don't want a slow third party to make my page rendering bad. So if I tack this data dash deferred on the front of it, I can make it where the page will get all the way to the onload event. So if I roll up here, after the page onload event fires, it'll call my load deferred. It'll find all of the stuff that I wanted to load later. So I've basically moved on our site. Most of our vendors are now deferred load. So our paint time got a lot faster. Our speed index improved. And my single point of failures went down because now if a vendor is slow, they can't make my paint wait because I'm already done basically rendering and then I'm going to go do all this stuff. So take a look at that if you're interested in that technique. Another cool thing with JavaScript, added the ability to do some async and deferred loads. So let's go pull up what that looks like. So here I have a web page that just has 3 JavaScript files. And if you're familiar with what happens in a browser, browsers will hit each one of those script files and they're going to wait for those JavaScript files to be downloaded and executed before they're going to render my content. So I'll show you another cool thing about Fiddler. You can set up, in autoresponder, you can set up rules. So I took those 3 JavaScript files and I made them intentionally slow. So the first one is 4 seconds, the second one is 2, the third one is 3, because I want to know if these things are slow, what kind of an impact. So this is good to try with third parties to make sure they can't impact your site. So if I turn those on, let me make sure I have my autoresponder, it's all enabled, okay? If I go back and run that, watch what's happened. My customer is sitting looking at a blank screen because these JavaScript files are taking too long to download. So now they each run. If it turns out those JavaScript files are not needed for the original paint, I can put on what's called async. So what I'm telling the browsers that understand it, download these, don't block the rendering, download these in the background. And in the case of async, as soon as that individual file is done, run it. So now if I go back and re-execute that page, I'm going to hit Control F5. The important thing is my content rendered. It's still spinning. Now, if you notice what's weird, 2 came first, then 3, and then 1 because of the way I set up my delays. I just wanted to show you that I'm claiming here that order doesn't matter. None of these JavaScript files depend on each other. If they do, there's also one called defer. So if I set defer, I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying don't block rendering, but run them in the order I have them specified because it matters. So again, it renders right away, but you'll see after 4 seconds, there's 1, 2, 3. So they're good techniques if you don't need your JavaScript to actually render your first part of your page. Make sure you use async or defer so that you're pushing them off and not blocking your rendering. Another cool thing is what's called resource hints. So let's look at some of those. So the idea with these is if I had, you can see I want to use a jQuery file off of ajax.microsoft.com. If I just left things the way they were, it would take until the browser got down here and it would notice, oh, I need to go connect to this. It would create a connection and it would start getting the file. Obviously, this is a really simple page. You have much longer pages. With these hints, I can tell it, hey, why don't you go pre-connect to ajaxmicrosoft.com right now. Eventually, you're going to need it. I know I need to do an HTTPS handshake. I need to do a connection. That takes a while. I need to do a DNS lookup. So the earlier I can tell the browser and give it a hint that it's going to need to do that, hopefully it gets a jump on that. So by the time it parses and gets down here, it's already got maybe the connection already done. So that's cool. I can do preload, which just says, not only do I want you to connect to the host, start downloading this file because you're going to need it eventually. So those are cool. Test those out. I've seen some good examples where that really makes a difference for rendering performance because they just tip off the browser to critical things a lot earlier. This last one is cool. If I knew that when you came to this page, the next page you were going to go to was default.htm, I can actually use pre-render. So what that does is it tells the browser, finish this page first. But when you're done, in the background, go pull down this next page. And not only pull the page down, get all of its images, JavaScript, CSS, and render it. So while I'm sitting looking at the screen trying to decide, oh, where do I want to go? I'm going to go to this link. I could click it. I might get an instant paint. I'm not waiting for downloads or anything. So it's super cool if your site follows that kind of behavior. I don't have that on my site. Like I don't have a place where I can really guess where you're going to go next. So I don't use this, but take a look at it because it's cool if it works for you. Some miscellaneous stuff. Focus on your critical rendering path. So look through your source and do things like the async and defer. Another thing people are doing if they're really serious about performance, they will take their CSS, they'll pull out the stuff that's called critical, right? The stuff that I need to do this basic paint, right? So if I were to go back to my page, maybe I just want to get it enough CSS to make this look like the gray background and stuff. If I could take that and embed that into your HTML page, as soon as the browser gets the HTML page, it can see that CSS and immediately start to give me this background. So again, as a perceived performance benefit, I as a customer will see, oh, something's happening right away. It doesn't need to wait for CSS. So just focus on what is the most important stuff to get that critical stuff to paint, and make sure you're doing that first and under the right priorities and using all the hints we talked about. Another thing to be aware of, URLs are case sensitive. So if you didn't know that, I've got, so I got a little bit of a contrived example, but I'll explain how it would actually happen. I've got the same image referenced here 4 times. Twice it uses the same case. These other two, it's got like capital F, capital B. This one just has a capital F. They're all the same image, but from a browser's perspective, it doesn't know that. So let me clear this out. Each of those URLs that has case differences looks different to a browser. So it's going to actually do download of all of them on major browsers. So if we go and look, I've just forced it to download the same image 3 times. So I wasted 4840, I'd have wasted almost nearly 100K that I didn't need to download because you already are going to download it once. Or worse, where this really happens, I reference a logo on the home page using all lowercase. You decide to do some other case on another page. So the person came to the home page, downloaded my stuff, I used expiration, it's sitting in the browser cache waiting to be used on the next page. You use the wrong case and you force a full download again from the server, ignoring everything that's in the cache. So years ago, we just made the rule, all of our URLs for resources are lowercase. Makes it really simple and avoids that problem where one developer does one thing versus the other and causes a bunch of extra downloads that we don't need. I'll mention font subsetting. So now that web fonts are popular, I happen to be working on a site where a company said, please use this font to show an announcement. So we said, okay, we took the font. The font was about 2 meg, which seemed a little large to me. So I said, I don't want every customer downloading a 2 meg font just to get a cute font on a page. So I went out to Font Squirrel and I actually looked at what was in that font, and it turns out that it had all sorts of Asian characters. You know, we're a US site. We don't need all that stuff. So we actually used what's called font subsetting. I took out all of the other character sets other than the US English, and I went from 2 meg down to 28K. So a huge improvement. So if you do a lot of font work, just look at, are the fonts you're getting, can you do subsetting to make those smaller? That could be a big win for you as well. We talked about HTTP2 briefly. So this came out in 2015. I started using it on our CDN probably 2 years ago. We now use it on the path to our production server. The big win again is the fully multiplexed on a single connection. So like I said, in the olden days, each host, the browsers would create 6 connections to. So that they would have to do 6 at a time. In the HTTP2 world, they'll do them all in parallel. So I'm going to show you a demo that I hate and like at the same time. So, and let me close. I got to close Fiddler before I do this, sorry. And I will run that again. So I'm going to hit Control F5. So this is using HTTP. If I use HTTPS, 71% faster. And you think that's weird. So the encrypted site is faster than the unencrypted. Well, it's actually faster because HTTPS requires, or I'm sorry, HTTP2 requires HTTPS. So now that I used HTTP2, if you watched again, this can only download 6 of these at a time because that's how HTTP 1.1 works. HTTP2 can do them all in parallel. So what I don't like about the demo is I don't have a web page that has 360 green little check marks on it. So it's a little contrived, but it is true that being able to multiplex gets rid of that 6 connections per host limit and can make a big difference if you have a lot of small resources on your site. So why do we care? If you do HTTP2, because of that multiplex connection, these are old things that I used to sell for years. Not sell, I didn't make any money on it, but these are things that I would say you should do to make things faster. So like I said, bundling all of your JavaScript files into a single file made sense in the HTTP 1.1 world. In the 2 world, not so much. You may not want to just dump it entirely, but the advantage of putting them all into a single file goes away because HTTP 2 doesn't penalize you for those additional connections, if that makes sense. If you've done CSS spriting before, that's where you take a bunch of small images, shove them into one image, and then use CSS to index into it. That again was a play to get around the connection limits. Another one people did was called domain sharding. So you had the cdn.example.com gave you 6 connections. If you created CDN2 and CDN3, you'd end up getting 6 more connections per host. So it took a little while for each connection to start up, but once they did, you'd have 18 connections instead of 6. Again, not an advantage anymore in HTTP2. The other thing people did, they took small images and embed them into the HTML using data URIs. Again, don't use it just to avoid the number of requests you're making. Same with CSS. You don't want to inline all of your CSS other than if you're inlining critical. So in other words, don't try to reduce requests just by shoving your whole style sheet into your HTML. because there's side effects to that. So if you're using HTTP2, just reconsider these suggestions. Some quick tools. Google Page Speed is good. You can go out and punch in a URL and it'll tell you stuff. I'm going to show you the Lighthouse version, which is basically built into, I actually used the new Edge browser. It uses Chromium for rendering, but I like the privacy and stuff better, so it's been my primary browser. So I'll just show you if we go to the before version. If I hit F12 and go to Lighthouse, they have all sorts of best practices. So I'm going to check out the performance and let it generate a report for me. What's cool about this, it's going to give me a score. So I like to score my site before and after changes, but it also, the big win here is it tells you things that you should fix. So if you're new to performance, it's going to walk through. So you see I scored a 49, but what's cool is it tells me all the stuff we just talked about, right? I have CSS I don't use. I didn't minify my JavaScript. I didn't minify my CSS. I don't have compression turned on. I'm not using async and defer. I'm not properly sizing my images. So it does a quick assessment and tells you here are some wins. And what I like about it is if you don't know what some of these things mean, like I don't know what compression is or how to turn it on, you can follow a more link and it'll have some docs to that. So again, I scored a 49 if I go look at the after version. I think I went there. Okay, I'm just going to kick off that report again. So again, it's just a nice quick assessment to tell me, first of all, the score. Oh, 97, I was 99 2 days ago. I don't know what's wrong. So I can come out here and look and find out what it might tell me I could still work on, which is kind of handy. Some resources. So I am a Pluralsight author. I have a course on web performance that goes into all of this in a bit more detail, shows you how to compress images, all that kind of stuff. I do have a web developer's guide to images, which also does that. It talks about which image formats are right, shows you how to use, in my case, PaintShop Pro, how to do the progressive, all that kind of stuff. My most recent one is debugging website with Fiddler and Chrome DevTools. And so it says you have this problem, right? Something doesn't look right. And it walks you through what's the right tool to use for that situation and shows you how. And then I also have a detailed course on Fiddler. The good news, all Pluralsight courses are available this weekend starting tomorrow for free. So if you're not a Pluralsight subscriber, you can go check out any of these, and please do, for the entire weekend and learn all of that stuff. Again, that's my Twitter, that's my email and blog. There's a link to my slides and code. So again, all the slides and the before and the after version of the site so that you can see how these techniques were used. So I think we have a little bit of time here if we want to pause and see if anybody has any specific questions they'd like to go through.
So there was one question earlier that I missed in the chat, but we can answer that now.
Okay.
So Jim is asking, any particular CDN service that you prefer? Not
really. So when we started years and years ago, Akamai was really the only player. There's so many players now. Azure has offerings. I don't have a strong affinity to any given CDN. Pick them out. We usually do a bake-off every couple of years, and we just do a try and buy, so to speak. We set up each one of them. We run timing tests. We compare what the speeds were like for what we'd have to pay. And because it's such a competitive landscape, it's easy to pick up, move, and get better deals. So I don't have anybody that is a huge win over some of the others.
Okay. Other questions? Quiet group tonight.
That's all right. It just totally made sense, right? It's a lot. It's actually a lot to absorb if you're pretty new to performance. I kind of hit you with a ton of techniques. So the important part is that if you remember, you heard some of the techniques and kind of have an ordering of what's important. There are good resources through Lighthouse. You can check out some of my Pluralsight courses where I go into detail to see it again. We'll have this recording up that you can review again. So if you got the concepts and the whys, now you can take it back and look at your particular environment framework, everything else to see how to actually use them. If that
Yeah,
makes sense.
and you mentioned web page test, which is an excellent resource, and they have those servers around the world, right? And so that's a
Yep.
really useful thing that you can, like you said, your servers are located in Minnesota, but what is the experience like for somebody coming from, California or from Florida or from New York? You get
Yep.
some real data on that.
Yep, it's a great way to target and display. And like I said, I like keeping the history. So I do get challenged years later where somebody will say, why are you compressing our JPEGs? Why does it matter? Well, here's why it matters. Here's the video of before and after. Here's the measurements. Here are the numbers, and here's the video to prove why we bothered to do that. So it's a good service.
Yeah, this is a really good. I really appreciate you talking through these particular things. I think the biggest thing I've seen, or the biggest change from Google Page Vitals, is that the original thing was, combine all the things, like combine all your JavaScript, one big bundle, minify it,
Yep.
and that was the way to go. And then it's completely changed, and like nobody got that message that the JavaScript compile time, compute time is really a big factor now into that, and we need to be thinking about things like Webpack and tree shaking to keep those things smaller and more
Yep.
dynamic, because it's needed on a per page basis.
Yeah, and the HTTP2 really opened that up, right? We don't need to
Totally.
bundle like that anymore, and it does make a big difference being able to download that stuff in parallel. Now you can have expiration on individual files, because that was a bad thing, right? If I made one single change to a JavaScript file, my whole bundle got invalidated, and you had to download the whole thing over again. So it totally made sense at the time. Now that I'm using HTTP2, that's something I'm trying to get rid of at this point. So.
Yeah, another thing I dropped in the chat, which is what I've seen useful for us and for our clients, is just using full-fledged dams as a way to get that image optimization. I don't know if that's something you've looked into or seen, or whether you have maybe a tighter connection between your design team and their ability to produce assets in a clean way.
Yeah, there's two sides to that. When it comes to my product pictures, if I can get them to crop them correctly how they want them, and I do that Photoshop batch, I have a consistent compression being applied and the JPEG tran, and so I know that stuff is solid. So I prefer that over a DAM, because I know then that it's serving from disk off my CDN. There's no processing time involved. However, I do get a lot of images that slip in from people that don't know how to do all of that stuff, where the DAM would do the sizing and some of the optimization and stuff for free. So it's kind of a mixed bag, right? Depending on who's contributing and where that comes from, I would like the DAM for that. But for the core stuff that I know I'm serving these product pictures, millions of times or whatever, I want those to be, I've optimized those myself, and I don't have to wait for the DAM to serve them, at least from a deployment standpoint, right? I just want that to be a static JPEG sitting on a disk using SourceSet in my case, to get the right sized one. And I think that's a win. So they both have their place, and it kind of depends on who your contributors are. If I had a social media site where anybody's just taking stuff off their phone and uploading, I think the DAM and that workflow and all that stuff would be great, right? Because they're not going to optimize their stuff before they upload them. So it kind of depends on your environment. But
We've got another question in
Sure.
chat. Can you elaborate on how to configure HTTP2 in existing ASP.NET framework websites?
So HTTP2 is going to be a server feature. And so Windows, I got to remember what version of IIS had it. I think it was Windows Server 2019. Yeah, I think it's 2019 is the first time that's part of IIS, and it'll actually be enabled by default, I believe. I happened to do it first so I was running older versions of Windows Server. Ops group was not ready to do upgrades of that yet. So I did my CDN first, which was actually an advantage because you're only really coming to me for the ASP.NET page. So you're only really making one request to my server. So whether I use HTTP2 for that or not, didn't get a lot of advantages, but having it at my CDN layer, which all the CDNs support it, and that was just a config for them. I just said light up HTTP2. And old browsers that don't support it will fall back to HTTP 1.1, but the CDN layer is where I'm getting lots of images in JavaScript and where that multiplexing helped. So if you have Windows Server 2019, or for my development machine, I'm using Windows 10, it should just be lit up by default. HTTP2 should be, and you shouldn't need to specify anything in ASP.NET to opt into that, because that's really a server level thing, if that makes sense.
I dropped a link in the chat. It looks like it's IIS 10. I'm not sure which version of Windows IIS 10 came out with, but there is a link in the chat with some more information.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then I'll drop another link out here. It does look like that's also available in Azure App Service, and I'm assuming that AWS and the other major players, cloud players have that as well. So
yes, and if you are stuck, so the other thing, our load balancers happen to support it before my backend web servers do. So I actually lit it up on my load balancer level, which gets it all the way from the client to me anyways in my data center using HTTP2. You can also reverse proxy with Cloudflare and others to get some of your security and stuff up front. All of those things are options as well. So
that's actually a good point, is that if you turn it on your server and things still don't seem to be acting the way you expect them to, is maybe go check your load balancer, because you probably are sitting behind a load balancer.
Yes.
And maybe it hasn't been turned on there. So,
and I'll give you one warning here, because you may run into it. So Fiddler still does not support HTTP2. So if you kick off Fiddler and you're trying to see what it's using, it'll actually drop down to 1. So when you're doing that kind of testing, come into DevTools, because it'll show you. So I think this must be my before version. If I go hit the after, try my Azure one to make sure I'm getting my, there you can see H2. So if you want to see, just be aware Fiddler won't show it because it'll drop, but you can see what protocol version you're actually using in DevTools here, just to spot check that it's working right to your client.
Other questions? All right. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and stop the recording.